It's about 8:30 in the morning on Sunday, October 6th, 2024. And I'm just kind of out here by myself, quietly thinking about things, which is one of my favorite parts of this system is that you have to get out here regularly, look at the animals and look at the grass and think about what your next move is going to be. And this grass here, down here, is all over my pasture. And I don't know what kind of grass it is or what its nature is. And one of the things that I want to do is study the different kinds of grasses that show up in my pasture. And I had this thought that if I could understand how these grasses behave and react to various conditions in the environment, that perhaps I can be a better steward of this land and raise stronger and healthier animals at even lower cost, and thus be a good farmer, right? So it gets back to questions that I have about the nature of reality and our relation to it. And I've been rereading some philosophical treatises on on this very topic, like what's real and what's mere fantasy, and how do we tell the difference. I think Rene Descartes wrote a lot about this. He wrote very extensively about it in his books. And his reasoning goes something like this, that despite all the learning that he's had, he's come to the conclusion that people really don't know what they're talking about. Not because they're ill-intentioned, and not for lack of trying, but some of the most fundamental questions elude even the simplest logic and reason. And so he starts from the very beginning, and he goes back to what it is that we can know, and rather than relying on probabilities, like something like it's likely that this is true, or it's possible that this is true, he wants to know what is actually true with absolute certainty, and how can we deduce such truth, right? And so he goes back to the very beginning, and then he realizes the only thing he can really know for certain is that because he thinks, therefore he must exist, right? That everything else is entirely contingent upon his ability to observe it and to think about it. So his rational faculties, his ability to reason and perform logic in the absence of any reality at all, is the ultimate truth. And I'm also of the opinion that that is the ultimate truth, that there's nothing else that really exists except for our ability to observe and think. And I'm going to kind of explain this to you. If you have a hard time grasping this concept and what it means. So I'm in a pasture, right? But what is a pasture? That's a word in the English language, and there's some meaning associated with that word. But absent a thinking capability, the word pasture is just nothing. It means nothing. And so something has to exist to interpret those letters, pasture, or the sounds that we recognize in the English language as pasture, right? And it turns those those markings on a piece of paper, or digital representation of those markings, or the sound patterns that we hear, into the concept of a pasture. And hearkening back to Plato's ideas that the ideal pasture doesn't exist, but we all know what a pasture is because we're comparing it with some ideal. And then I can go back and I can kind of tell you that, what I mean by pasture is a piece of ground that's set aside for the grazing of animals that typically grows grass, but may contain other things. And farmers use it not for, sowing and reaping, but for feeding their animals. And so that entire process can't happen unless there is a mind to perceive it and to think about it and to reason about it. And so Rene Descartes, he starts there. He says, I think, therefore I am. That's the famous statement. And lots of times people don't go beyond that and the implications of what that means. Rene Descartes, for instance, his next conclusion, his next observation, as he tries to reconcile reality with logic and reason, is that my existence, that's contingent upon its ability to rationally reason and think, implies that there is a greater thinker and a greater perceiver. And he uses several methods to identify and name that creature, that thing, as God, obviously. And I'll use the one that I like the most. It goes something like this. So my thoughts recognize that some of my thoughts are broken. They're not consistent. They're erroneous, right? So I might think that 2 + 2 is 7, right? But that would be wrong, right? And how do we know it's wrong or right? It's correct or incorrect. How do we know one of our thoughts is true or false? And Rene Descartes, he says basically that obviously there's something that makes one thought correct and one other thought false. And it can't be tied to reality, right? So 2 + 2 is not 7, not because of something we observe in nature, but for some more fundamental reason. And his analysis is that there must be another thinker, independent from ourselves, and that thinker must be able to conceive of all possible true thoughts and all possible false thoughts and label one as true and one as false, right? So the very act of questioning whether a thought I have is true or false implies that there must be a God that announces that one is true and one is false. That, by whatever mechanism that thinker uses, that thinker declares that one is false and one is true. And he furthermore goes on and he talks about, the popular movie series, The Matrix. Of course, he doesn't call it The Matrix, but he engages in a thought pattern that's not new to him, but he kind of identifies it with the concept that perhaps there is an infinite being out there that incorrectly labels thoughts true and false. It says 2 + 2 is 7. It's definitely not 4, though. And perhaps that thinker has some method of communicating with, me, the thinker, that I know that exists, right? And how do we identify whether, that demon, the illogical God, how do we discern one from the other, one that's true and one that's not? And his conclusion seems to be that you can't really tell, except that you have within yourself the ability to identify with the infinite creator, the infinite God that is true. And so by yourself, God is also communicating with you at the same time, even though a being might come to you in one way or the other and communicate 2 + 2 is 7. You're able to connect with that God that says, no, 2 + 2 is 4. It is not 7, right? And so you're able to identify because of his gifts, him revealing himself basically to you in some degree or another. You're able to identify truth. And unfortunately, it seems that this infinite God that is the true God, that speaks truth and identifies error, he, for some reason, does not want to reveal everything to you all at once, right? So while he will reveal to you the truth of some things and the falsity of other things, he won't give it to you all at the same time, right? And so we're left kind of in this limbo land where our mind is a muddled mess of true and false thoughts. And we are able to identify true thoughts through careful study and, thinking. And we're able to map true thoughts to true thoughts, so we can connect two true thoughts together. We can say, for instance, if 1 + 1 is 2, and 1 + 2 is 3, then 1 + 3 must be 4. Because 1 + 1 is 2, 1 + 2 is 3, and 1 + 3 is 4, right? And we're able to identify, the connecting rules that basically govern all thoughts. And this goes back to earlier philosophy, where was it Francis Bacon? I forget who it was, but he wrote basically his idea is that man exists independent of nature, kind of like Rene Descartes, thinking machine that exists. And so he supposes that what we do is all we can do basically is put things in nature or take things out. We just move things around, right? We flip switches and we manipulate knobs and turn dials, right? That's what we do. Everything's a device. Whether I put cows in one part of my pasture or the other, that's up to me. That's what I do, right? I'm the thing in this universe that gets to make a choice. Everything else doesn't make choices. I do, right? And so I can choose one thing or the other. And so along with that choice comes a responsibility to make good choices. And so I have to understand what the effect of moving the cows or leaving the cows where they are would be, right? And that relies on me believing in a set of axioms or rules that basically govern all of nature. And so, for instance, I might come up with a rule that it appears that when I move cows onto an area that doesn't have much grass, the cows don't have enough to eat, right? That might be one of these axioms that I have. And unfortunately, the way human reason works is we believe in experiments that somebody else did a long time ago in a different place, even though they really didn't do that much experimentation at all. But we take their experiment as fact. And so we take with a little bit of evidence some other person's ideas as fact simply because of who they are or what they represent, right? The science, basically. And the other thing we do is we observe things that, happen again and again and again. And then we determine that just because we observe it over and over again, it must be a fact, right? And he says both of those thinkings are erroneous because oftentimes what we do is when we see a violation of those axioms, of those rules that we've come up with, is instead of saying, oh, the axiom is busted, we tend to redefine things around the axiom and say, well, I guess that was an exception to the rule, right? For instance, I might have the axiom that no animal can fly, right? I might have looked at all the animals on Earth and said, oh, these animals don't fly. Therefore, no animal can fly, right? Because that's the common pattern that I see. But then I look up in the sky and I see a bird flying, and I want to say that's an animal because it has, many characteristics shared with animals. But what we tend to do instead is say like, oh, birds must not be animals then because they're flying, right? And so we avoid modifying the axioms, the rules that we come up with, and instead we try to redefine things to fit the axioms that we have, when a more proper investigation is to question whether or not the proposal, like no animal can fly, is indeed true, right? And when we find a counterexample to it, like, a bird that is clearly an animal by all definitions of the word animal, flying, we might say, the rule that no animal can fly is clearly false, right? And so we need to say that that's false, that there are indeed animals that do fly, and so it's not a general rule that no animal can fly, right? So that's what we should be doing, is questioning the axioms rather than questioning our definitions of things. And we should stick to a logical, consistent theories and ideas about things so that when we communicate with each other, we have a standard that we're using that are based on very simple rules. And if those rules are correct, then we can infer other rules simply from those rules at first, right? Whereas if the rules are highly subjective in nature and inconsistent, then we're left kind of struggling because we can't derive truths from a combination of the rules that we already know. And anyway, his point is that we need to be very careful about the way we think and the way we define things. So anyway, that's kind of what I'm thinking about right now is, these general rules that I've come up with, what are the actual underlying rules and how do they actually work, right? And then testing through careful experimentation and documentation, especially of those experiments, whether the definitions I've come up with are useful and whether the theories I've come up with are also useful. One thing Rene Descartes says in his books is that when you're starting off, realizing that you know nothing, that you know very little at all, if anything, he says that first of all, lots of philosophers or lots of people with ideas, they have this idea that we should just tear down the entire city and rebuild it the way that I think is best, right? And what they don't realize is that in history that doesn't happen, right? Nobody goes through and systematically tears down a city to rebuild it in a new way, right? Granted, new cities can be built following some new philosophy, a new idea about the proper way to arrange cities. But old cities, you can't do that, right? However, and this is kind of one of the keys that he comes up with, he says you can, however, tear down a house and rebuild it, right? And especially if you have one mind that's kind of governing the action, that new house that you build can be consistent with itself rather than built on a hodgepodge of, former architecture, good or bad, right? So he comes up with 3 rules to govern his life while he thinks about the nature of things. And the first rule is don't buck tradition, right? The laws that are in effect in your country, the laws and customs of your religion and culture, just kind of stick to the mean. Don't be too extreme one way or the other, but just kind of stick to the mean, right? That's a good rule of thumb. Until such a time as you're able to determine for yourself whether a custom or a law or a rule is good or bad, don't go around just breaking laws to break laws. Don't go around breaking customs just to break customs, right? Be a good citizen, right? The second thing is have a very good rule for what you accept and what you don't. Be consistent about how you understand things and question those laws of consistency that you've come up with. And I believe the third thing, the third thing was, I don't remember what the third thing is, but basically he was advocating for not being extreme one way or the other, taking your time, and don't be so ready to knock everything down. We have a saying in our church, we say, doubt your doubts before you doubt your knowledge, right? So if you know something, don't just abandon it willy-nilly. Be careful with what you adopt, but also careful what you abandon, right? And I think his observation is what we've seen in modern science, is that we have kind of a scientific status quo that exists for a period of time until a new generation comes in with a new set of assumptions that completely overthrows the old paradigm, right? And of course, every generation wants to overthrow the previous generation. Everybody wants to be famous for overturning some famous theory of science or whatever. But we have to be careful when we do that, Kind of his point is that you don't really, you while you're rebuilding your house, you have to live in a house, right? So don't be so hasty to tear down your own house. Be very judicious in what you do there. Anyway, last little bit of news, if you've read this far or listened this far. I don't know if you're actually reading a video, but whatever. So my daughter, she's starting her 18-month mission today, actually. So today we're going to take her to the leader of the church in our area, and he's going to lay his hands on her head and set her apart as a missionary for the next 18 months. My son is already serving a mission. He's in Colorado. My daughter's going to be in Utah, of all places. And so that means we have 2 missionaries in the field at the same time, which means that I'm going to be more lonely at home without so many kids to bother me. But this is a very sacred moment, I guess, in my life, when I get to watch my kids start their life's journey the way that mine started so many years ago. I served a mission. I went to Seoul, Korea for my mission back in 95 to 97. And that was a fantastic experience. And I hope that my children will have a similar experience. It's not all good. Bad stuff does happen on your mission, and there is heartaches and heartbreaks. And it's physically challenging many times to be a missionary. But I hope that, they'll be blessed with the same kind of communion with the Spirit and with God that I had through it all. And my message to you, this being Sunday and all, I've said before how important it is to make that connection with God, but one of the things that I think it's a false doctrine that's being taught as true doctrine that we need to rid ourselves of is this idea that the Bible is perfect or it's complete. Both of those ideas are false. The Bible isn't perfect, but God is. And the Bible isn't complete, but God is. And the Bible points us to God, right? The Bible tells us to ask, seek, and knock. The Bible tells us to wait on the Lord to reveal his will to us. And the Bible tells us to live by faith in Christ alone, right? And the Bible tells us to, what else does it tell us? To be humble, submissive, full of love for fellow mankind. But at no point does the Bible teach that the Bible is complete or the Bible is, the only word of God. We must be ready and willing to accept further revelation from God. Allow him to speak. Allow him the privilege to speak his mind to our minds. And don't cut ourselves off by saying that everything God has to say has been said. So in your prayers, in your exercises, mental and otherwise, go try to make that connection with God and get answers from God to the questions that you have. I have a lot of experience myself and watching others go through that process too. And I'm not going to say that it is an easy process, that it's a simple matter. It's not for anybody. But reconciling your will to God's will is the entire point, right? I think of mortality is to allow us to experience, independence, so that we understand the importance of dependence, and that we can understand the true path to progression, upwards and forwards, what that means and how that works. So guys, have a great day. Take care and bye-bye.